All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone who's joined us here today. And thank you for joining us for this panel, Trans Representation in Film. My name is Brody Weaver, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Youth Project, and I'm pleased to be moderating this discussion today. So before introducing our panelists and diving into discussion, I have some kind of housekeeping pieces to hold here. So this panel and on-demand screening of Dawn, her dad, and the tractor is on occasion of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission's Human Rights Week, which is from December 3rd to December 10th. And this is the first event of what is to be an ongoing series called Human Rights on Screen, which uses the power of film to ignite conversations about human rights and equity in Mi'kma'ki and beyond. So I want everyone to know that this panel is going to be recorded, and the recording will be available on the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission's website. And this panel is set to be an hour and a half long, so ending around 1:30 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. So we'll begin with some facilitated conversation and discussion among our panelists before ending with questions from the audience. And you can submit these questions at any point during the panel, and I will pose them to Shelley and Marley towards the end. And before getting started here, it's essential that we recognize that the colonially named province of Nova Scotia is in Mi'kma'ki, which is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq people. So any conversation about human rights would be amiss without acknowledging the historic and ongoing violence of settler colonialism on these lands and globally, including the active genocide occurring in Palestine at the hands of the settler state of Israel. So the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission is committed to protecting and advancing human rights for all Nova Scotians, and the context for this work is built upon the foundational advocacy of Nova Scotians who sought equality, fairness, justice, and greater equity and inclusion. And it is particularly important that we recognize the activism of African Nova Scotians in the founding of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission itself, and in particular, the work of Dr. William Oliver, Donald Oliver, Gus Wedderburn, Carrie Best, and Delmore Buddy Day, whose activism for their communities prompted wide-ranging legislative amendments to the Human Rights Act, to which we all benefit. So I encourage you all to learn more about this history, and I'm going to share a link in the chat from the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission's website, which can be a starting point for some of that learning for everyone. All right, I hope everyone can see that link. So I am joined today by our phenomenal panelists, filmmakers Shelley Thompson, the director of Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor, and interdisciplinary artist Marley O'Brien, to discuss how transgender representation in film can help to advance understanding and offer an opportunity to unpack assumptions and misconceptions. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar, I'm just going to read the synopsis of Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor before more comprehensive introductions of Shelley and Marley. So Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor is set on a Nova Scotia dairy farm. John Andrew has lost his wife, Miranda, to cancer. When a young woman with a startling resemblance to Miranda appears on his porch, an odyssey towards understanding begins. John Andrews' estranged son, Donald, is now Dawn, and she's come home to mourn her mother and keep her promise to repair her relationship with her dad. Restoring the tractor her mother learned to drive on becomes a focus for the mechanically minded Dawn. John Andrew begins to realize that if he is to reclaim this relationship, he has to come out with Dawn. And what better setting than the community tractor trials, an event Miranda created as a tireless village volunteer, where he proudly cheers for his daughter Dawn as she enters the arena at the wheel of the lovingly restored tractor. So now I'd like to introduce Shelley Thompson. So Shelley Thompson is an award-winning actor, screenwriter, and activist based in Wolfville and Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia. And she's acted in, directed, and produced numerous projects for film and television. Her first feature film, Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor, premiered at Inside Out International Film Festival in Toronto in May 2021, and also screened in Whistler, BC, Amsterdam's Rose Film Dagen, the BFI Flare Film Festival in London, UK, as well as across the US and in Germany. So among many prizes and awards, the film won the 2022 Nova Scotia Masterworks Award. Thompson is working on projects for TV and cinema under the banner of her emerging production company, Rusty Tractor Productions Incorporated. And her second novel, as she has just released her first, Roar, which is garnering critical acclaim. And she's committed to LGBTQ plus 2SP ally and is a parent to singer-songwriter T. Thompson. So thank you so much for joining us here today, Shelley. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Marley O'Brien to introduce herself.
Thank you, Brody. Hello, everyone. My name is Marley O'Brien. I'm a trans woman and an interdisciplinary artist and filmmaker based currently in Halifax and Mi'kma'ki. I grew up in rural Nova Scotia, around some areas where Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor were filmed. So I'm very excited to be able to take part in this. I graduated from NASCAD last year with a fine arts degree in painting, and I've also been busy as a filmmaker in the last couple of years. I just produced a short film called The Score 97.9, which premiered at the Atlantic International Film Festival this fall, and will be playing in Berlin in the Final Girl Festival later this year, so, or next year, I suppose. But anyways, thanks.
Thank you, Marley, for introducing yourself today. So at this point, I would like to get into some questions for you two. So I realize we've kind of gotten into this one a little bit already, but maybe we can start with Shelley and then go over to Marley. And the question is, I'm hoping that you can both, in your own words, speak to your respective backgrounds in film that have brought you to where you are today and to this panel, starting with Shelley.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brody, and nice to see you, Marley. And I'm delighted to be here. I started my career as an actor and worked for many years in the UK, and then came to Nova Scotia because the beaches were empty. In one phrase. And at that point, we had a child, a baby, and thought that was the best place. As one ages, you're looking for opportunities to take more control of your future. And certainly for me, I felt that I had a lot of stories to tell. So I started working in film as a screenwriter. And while I was at the CFC, my child began their transition. And with their blessing and their help and their encouragement, I started to work on this story, Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor. and to try and capture some of what I, as a parent, was experiencing and what I imagined a community needed to experience to best support trans individuals. And so that resulted in Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor, and my being on this panel. Is that good?
That's great, Shelley. Thank you so much for that background and context about yourself and what's brought you here. I'm just going to pass it over to Marley for the same now.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I grew up being a pretty theatrical child, and luckily there were some adults in my community when I was little who were supportive of that and gave me some opportunities to express myself when I was younger. And as I got older, I realized I had an interest in acting and in film production in general. So when I moved to Halifax, and I had friends who were involved in short film production, primarily through AFCOOP, the Atlantic Filmmakers Cooperative, I had the opportunity to act in a Film 5 a few years ago. And it was such a positive experience being on a film set, and sort of a queer film set as well. And that led to the opportunity to produce a short film over the last year, which was really, really gratifying. I realized that I had skills that could work in multiple areas of filmmaking, not just on screen and not just behind screen. But yeah, so very excited about that, and looking forward towards doing more film projects in the future. Don't know exactly what my role will be, but I'm feeling open to it.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Marley. I'm really, really pleased to be here with you both and be combining, all of your knowledge respectively that you have about film and trans experiences here in Mi'kma'ki as, trans people themselves, and also the family and caretaker of trans people. So my next question here is specifically for Shelley. And I'm hoping that you can kind of talk more about the process of making Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor, and, maybe some thoughts that you have about the kind of impact that this film has had since it's been released.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if you want like the kind of technical background, the way we came to fruition, the funding, stuff like that. Is that useful information? Just briefly, I guess. The film script was finished in about 2018. We started working towards getting funding in various areas. Eventually the film script won the feature film award from the Women in the Director's Chair, which is a really great organization. For any of you people out there who are interested in filmmaking, you should look at that organization, because they're enormously supportive of a huge range of opportunities. And because it won that prize, it meant that there was about $250,000 of in-kind support for the film. So we had what we are always searching for, and I'm sure Marley, you'll agree with this. You're always searching for that first positive moment where you go, yes, we can actually do this. Somebody has said this is worth doing. And so once we had that, we were able to gain the support of Telefilm Canada. We were hugely supported by the town of Antigonish. I really want to shout out to local communities supporting local filmmakers. It's amazing, and often we can't make these projects without that happening. We had a tremendous cast, which we were really excited about. For years, I was in a series called The Trailer Park Boys. And so I had a colleague with whom I had a great relationship, Rob Wells, who plays Ricky in that series. And I'd always kind of imagined him in this role as I was, writing it. Rob agreed to do the project. He was not just a wonderful actor, but a beautiful human, a wonderful company leader. He led from the front with enormous compassion and care for his cast and for people experiencing, and he was learning. He was really aware that he was learning all the time. So the making of the film was a really joyful time. We were the first film out of the gate in Eastern Canada, I think maybe east of Toronto, I can't swear to it, in the pandemic. So we were shooting in early August 2020. And I don't know if you remember that time, but it was insane. We were all scared. We didn't know what was coming at us. And on film sets, we didn't know how to manage them yet. We didn't know, were actors all going to have to wear masks all the time? Like, we didn't know any of these answers. And so the making of the film was a big learning curve. Is there more that I need to add to that? There was a second part to your question, I think.
Yeah. Thanks, Shelley, for that like technical stuff. I'm also wondering, like, for yourself as like a cisgender person, like in terms of making the film, I'm like, how did you kind of ensure that this film was going to be doing your narrative justice? Like, I'm also curious to hear about any like kind of like consultation or kind of brainstorming that you did in terms of kind of the product of the film itself and the narrative.
Thank you. That's a great question and an important question. There's a lot of talk around sensitivity reading at the moment and consultants. And from the very beginning, I was really clear that we had to have those readers. We had to have them paid for their work. We had to recognize and alter accordingly. And we did. And what was really important to me was, I'm not the person to write a film about transition. I'm not a person to write the film about how it feels inside a trans individual. That's not my world. That's not my right. That's not what I needed to do. I needed to write a story about a family who were coming to grips with that. And as a parent, I, with the help of my husband actually, and my son, was able to discuss, the things that we had been through, the things that we'd grappled with, the challenges that we'd had, and make sure that they were represented in this script. Now, one caveat I would add is I had a trans individual at the center of this. There were elements of their journey which were more intimate or personal than I could ever speak to. So it was very important to me that they were there with the blessing of trans individuals. And so I was fortunate, I think I said this already, but I'll just restate because it can't be stated strongly enough. I had trans individuals in New York where I've got a continuing relationship with a wonderful trans woman here who's a beautiful actor called Dana Levinson. And in Toronto, I had 3 trans women who were incredibly helpful to me, one of whom is on the national dodgeball team, Savannah Burton, and Maya Henry, who played the role eventually, and Sydney Sarajevo, who was up for the role. Ultimately, we cast a different direction, but they were tremendously helpful and a wonderful and generous responder to the script.
Thank you so much, Shelley. It's really, I think, valuable for everyone and for myself to hear about the process of what that kind of consultation and community input looked like. And the final part of my question here for you is, I'm wondering if there's anything you want to share about like how you have perceived or felt or, directly heard about the impact of this film since it was released in 2021.
Yeah. Gosh, isn't that funny? It makes me emotional, a little bit emotional. The film has been very kindly received. the responses from the trans community, and even more importantly, from families of trans individuals who are going through the process and figuring it out. We've had a lot of responses reaching out to us and saying this, a variety of things. This helped us start the conversation. This taught us to listen. This taught us, that it's not a hard journey if your commitment is because you love an individual, you love your child. It's not a hard journey. If you love someone, all you want is for them to be safe and happy. That's kind of the end of the story. And for us, certainly in our family, that was true. But we realized that as a family who have some, there's some visibility to us. It was even more important that we be approachable, that we offer ourselves to respond and help and, talk about our experience, always with our son's permission.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shelley. I think that's one of my favorite aspects of the film, is that it's really a portrait of a family and a community grappling with change, which I think is so universal. And I think there's such value in creating a story and narrative about that for people to be able to see an example and a rubric of, ways in which the community and family responds really well, and ways in which they misstep, to be able to kind of have that rubric for themselves. I think it's really quite incredible. So,
I think
oh
if
no,
I could just add one thing, one of the things that's been really important to me is finding a way of expressing, and it wasn't terribly easy in the film. I can talk about this more a little bit later, but it needed a little bit more space to talk about the gentleness with which the learning process has to be approached in helping people sometimes, because I think the danger is the fear of judgment when people make a mistake with pronouns, or when they don't understand, or they're trying to understand. Oftentimes it comes from a place of fear of doing the wrong thing, being seen to do the wrong thing. And so finding a way to be gentle and open was really an important part of this film.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. And I think that really shows through. So thank you for that. And now I'm gonna pass it over to the wonderful Marley here for another question. So Marley, I'm like, as a trans woman born and raised here in Mi'kma'ki, I'm hoping that you can talk more to what you think the value of this film is specifically. And you kind of spoke to it earlier about how a lot of your lived experiences are kind of similar to this film in terms of where it was made. So yeah, just giving you some room to talk about what you think the value of this film is, and anything you wanted to share about your own lived experience as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, there were points watching this film. Well, I mean, multiple aspects of this film affected me differently watching it for the first time. Some things felt semi-surreal. For instance, the fact that locations in the film are locations where I've actually had my own experiences, like the cafe that Dawn visits and has friends that work at. I mean, that's a cafe that I had some of my first open gender conversations with some of my high school friends, when I would meet some of my first like openly non-gender conforming people in my small town. We would go to this exact same cafe, and I know that's very specific to my experience and people from Antigonish, but it was special, and I felt incredibly seen, and I felt like I was seeing my own experience on film a little bit. So of course, of course there was that, and just seeing, the shots of the rural areas and just seeing farmland that looked like the places that I grew up was really special for me. Watching the film, I will say, one element that I didn't expect to speak to me so intensely, but that did, was the dynamic of being a trans child in a more working class family, and some struggles that felt specific to that when I was first confronting my family with my transness, my parents specifically. I'm an only child, and my parents are both working class, and they worked incredibly hard when I was a kid to, give me, a home and food, and I was always so well taken care of by my parents in terms of material needs, and I could see how much that they worked for that. And I think something that I hadn't completely grappled with until watching this movie, or I'm still grappling with it, is I think there's a certain amount of shame that comes from proposing something as large as I need to transition to parents who work really hard just for the basics of, life. Like, it almost felt like I was asking for a luxury car or a trip to Paris or something really self-indulgent and fancy, and something that didn't fit into my parents' lifestyles, which were very, kind of down to earth. And there was something about transitioning that, maybe partially from my own perspective and just the way that it's represented in media, seemed more like, maybe more like a luxury than what it really was, which was just I needed to medically transition to combat dysphoria and to live my life. And eventually, my parents understood that completely. But I remember when I first, brought it to their attention when I was 16 years old, I felt a lot of shame, because I felt like I had seen them work so hard to make me happy and healthy my whole life. And then I felt like I was essentially accusing them of having done something wrong or not having provided enough for me, when really that wasn't the case. My parents have always been incredibly loving. And although it was painful and frightening for them to deal with the fact that I was trans initially, it didn't take long before they understood that this was just a basic health and mental health necessity. And I wasn't asking for, a trip to Paris and a luxury handbag. And I had to, it took me a while to let go of that shame of having to ask for this. So that really hit me hard. Watching John Andrew in the film and his neighbors, their life is so revolved around their work, and just kind of, keeping the house, keeping the farm, just day to day, in and out, and seeing the way that, John Andrew and some of the other characters in the town reacted to Dawn's transness as being some sort of, trouble or extra or something that's not necessary. Like, what's all this highfalutin fancy living with your sex change and all that, that I found very relatable in a few ways. And it helped me look back on my own internal narratives about transitioning, in a rural working class household. So I found that really special, and I'm grateful for that. I would also say, this has also just come to me a little bit in the last couple of days since watching the film, the relationship, and all families have different dynamics, but something that I saw mirrored from my experience in Dawn, her dad, and the tractor, was the fact that although I did tell both my parents at essentially the same time, there was a sense that my mom would understand better than my dad initially. And I don't know why exactly. I think there was just a sense of, I think what I was speaking to earlier about it being feeling like I was asking for too much. Like I think I perceived that feeling coming stronger from my father than from my mother, which wasn't really true. But at the time, I felt that way. And it was very special to watch Dawn, you know, rebuild this connection as a daughter with her father, because, you know, coming out as trans, it definitely, you know, created, you know, distance between me and my father, not in a way where either of us were upset with each other, but just in a way that we didn't know how to approach each other. And there's a lot of tenderness that you typically see between fathers and daughters, especially in film and television, you know, where there's a lot of boundaries that fathers and sons have that I think fathers and daughters often don't have, in terms of like emotionally opening up to each other and sweetness and things like that. And it took me and my dad a couple years of me transitioning before we got to a place where I felt like his daughter and not just like his child who was trans. So it was special to see that relationship happen on screen as well, because it reminded me of my experience relating to my dad in a whole new way than I had before. I mean, some things are the same. We have, you know, the same sense of humor that we always did, and we can still make each other laugh and talk about the things that we used to. Like, we both like cars, so we're both, you know, similar to Don. There's like a mechanical mindedness that we can always bond about, but just in the way that, you know, he could introduce me as his daughter, or, you know, he'll call me sweetheart and stuff like that. That's different than it ever was before. And yeah, it was special to see that on film.
Thank you, Marley. I really resonate with everything you were just saying, and I think it's a testament to, you know, the value and power of this film, that it kind of brought up all these emotions for you and made you feel seen in these specific ways. I'm also a trans woman. I'm not from Mi'kma'ki or Nova Scotia here. I'm from Ontario, but an aspect of the film that really mirrored my lived experience that I've never really seen depicted so well was, I did transition kind of geographically away from my family. So I have had that experience of like returning to my family after having gone through the works of transition, and seeing that represented in that scene where Dawn arrives on the deck and they're like, who even is this, was really, really quite powerful for me as well. And I'm sure many other viewers. So thank you so much, Marley. Okay. So my next question here is one for both of you, and maybe we can go to Shelley first and then over to Marley. And my question is, again, it's something we've kind of touched on, but maybe there's more to say. I'm wondering if there's any specific moments in the film, be that the process of producing it or the final product, that you wanted to kind of highlight or comment on or dig deeper into. Yeah, starting with Shelley.
Oh gosh. Golly. I think the thing about filmmaking, and I'm sure Marley will bear me out in this, is that once you see the film on screen, you can imagine it another 100 different ways. So there are lots of things in the film that I love, but there are also still a lot of things that I would have revised. But in terms of the things that mattered to me, in terms of the story that mattered to me, I think the thing was, I wanted this story to speak to elements. I wanted this story not just to speak to trans individuals who'd been through this process. I wanted this story to speak to families who've been lost in estrangement, because I don't know if I know a family that hasn't had some kind of estrangement to cope with, or some kind of crisis that they have to work through and come to the other side. And so I think for me, one of the things that was really important to me, and I grew to understand it more as I was working on it, and as I was actually kind of in the edit and was, it's kind of like you don't know what you've got until you're done, or you see it, or you go, oh, that's what that is about, and I think that's one of the things that I came to understand a lot better was this, I might have thought that I was making a trans film, and I didn't want it to be like my perception of trans films. These are terribly generic ways of speaking, but forgive me. I didn't want it to be negative. I didn't want it to be focused on a physical journey. I didn't want to be offering a sop to people whose curiosity is inappropriate. I wanted to say, here's some people who are struggling, and they're struggling in a family, and they can either work to make this family help them, or they can lose everything. So how do we manage that? And that's just people. That's just people. And so I guess of the things that I learned as I was going right through the process is that it was just people. And the best thing that could happen to me is if an audience, every audience, just saw this film as just people, because that's what we need. Like, we just need to recognize in all of us, in every area, in every gender, in every socioeconomic and cultural context, it's just people.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you, Shelley. I think that's like particularly what's powerful about film is really depicting the nuances and complexity of the characters, and turning that really into a narrative. And I really appreciate what you said about the like generalization of talking about like a trans film or a trans narrative, or even the topic of the panel, trans representation in film, when really the trans community, I'm glad that we exist in an umbrella to create some, coalition and solidarity, but there's such a wide diversity of experiences in this community, right? Which is why I'm excited that there's so much more production happening in terms of trans folks in front of and behind the camera. So thank you so much. So just going to pass it over to Marley, and I'm going to repeat the question for you. And the question is, if there's any specific moments in the film, for you, this would be more so the final product, that you wanted to kind of highlight or comment on or dig deeper into.
Yeah, well, just briefly, I appreciate a lot of what Shelley was saying in terms of how to tell stories about, trans experiences and people close to trans people, in the sense that there's a lot of room to write and direct and make a tragedy, when, in my lived experience, being trans is not a tragedy. It has hardships, but it's also the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me. So I think I appreciate that this film showed trans joy as much as the trans struggle, because I just think that's so important. We don't want trans people to be mistaken as tragedies, because we're not. And I think that's something that's been a problem in like queer representation in film for a long time, is the focus on the hardship, which is there, but there's a way to tell it where you don't leave out the humor and the surprise and the joy of being trans and sharing that with your family. I mean, just thinking about specifically, I think it's the first scene where Dawn and her sister and her sister's fiance visit the bar, and there's rude comments being made, and just the way that Dawn's sister jumped to her defense so quickly and so suddenly and showed so much solidarity, even though we knew that we knew that the sister was still struggling to understand this herself, but she put, you know, supporting her sibling before anything else. And I think that spoke to me. Those little moments of sometimes you don't understand everything that, you know, a trans or a queer person is going through, but you can still respect them as a human being and stand up for them in basic ways, especially when they tell you your pronouns. You know, that's an easy thing to help stand up to. Yeah, that's about it in terms of specifics right now.
Thank you, Marley. I agree. I think that scene in the film is really quite powerful, and I imagine it would really embolden a lot of people watching to be like, oh, that's an example of what that kind of solidarity can look like, which I think is really, really wonderful. And yeah, the trans tragedy kind of narrative that, you know, so many films might fall into. I do really agree that Don Her Dad and the Tractor resists, and those moments of joy are really, really quite powerful, and it's really really a wonderful aspect, the joy. That's great. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I'm like wondering, Shelley, I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to share on this one before our next question.
Oh, I just wanted to respond to Marley and thank her for mentioning that scene. I love that scene for all kinds of reasons, for so many reasons. One of which though is technical, and it's the scene in the film that I'm almost the most, well, there are two scenes that I'm the most proud of. One is that scene and one is the fire scene. But that scene I was really proud of because the actors, we didn't have a fight coordinator or a fight director. So, but I had really solid actors who were really game. And I blocked it and blocked the fight the way I would block a stage fight. And so I thought, this could be really cheesy or okay. And I was so proud. I'm really proud of that scene because as with what the actors did, it really worked. It was really dangerous. You believed everybody was getting hit, and and I was really proud of myself, but I was also really proud of the actors, the way they committed, to this moment, which would have been dealt with in a very different way had we had a lot of money and a lot of time, which we did not have. This film was shot, just FYI, we had 18 days and we lost half a day because of various things. So those actors had to come on song and on their game, and they did every day.
Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about the technical side of that scene as well, and also some more technical pieces around the shooting length and, the time when you were shooting, as you said earlier, as 2020. I'm like, wow, that's almost hard to imagine now. I really commend you and all of the actors for the work that went into this. Thank you.
Well, and I'll just give a shout out to the production team, the producer, Terry Greenlaw, and all the producing managers and stuff like that. They really, they had to have their shit together, because we just didn't know from 1 minute to the next whether we were going to be able to shoot or not. So yeah, I'd like to just commend all of them.
Yeah, it really takes a village, and I'm also sure it took a lot of COVID rapid tests as well. Okay, awesome. So 12:44, we're getting close to the halfway mark here, and we don't have to go quite to the end, but I do have some more questions. So my next question is, and it's a little more heady. We're getting a little more a little more abstract as we go along from the specific film to this topic of trans representation. So in terms of like forwarding, human rights and trans liberation movements, I think that many trans community activists have been critical of the hypervisibility of trans people in the media and have really cautioned that this visibility cannot stand in for real material grassroots change. So kind of with that context, I'm hoping that maybe starting with Marley and then going over to Shelley, if you could talk about like maybe more broadly or specifically, however it might resonate with you, kind of topic of this panel of trans representation in film, and what that means to you.
Stunning. Yeah, great topic for discussion. I feel like, there can be, university classes and research projects done on what trans representation in film means and looks like and the effects of it. I guess I just want to start by, agreeing with the notion that representation in media, especially, Hollywood and kind of elite media, is not at all a stand-in for real material change for the trans community. I mean, my life materially didn't change at all when, Caitlyn Jenner was awarded whatever and so on. And, a few trans celebrities make great strides for themselves. And it sort of gives this illusion of progress. And it's not that there hasn't been progress. And I do believe in the importance of trans representation in film and music and fashion and art and everything. But, since I heard the saying, I think it goes, representation without protection is just a trap. And I think that we have probably seen some backlash from the immense amount of trans representation in media lately with, ridiculous, hateful laws and rhetorics that are, gaining a lot of power in, the United States and Canada and, like the whole Western world really, about the dangers of trans people. And there's almost this, it's strange because you want the world to know that there are trans people everywhere and that we will continue to be born and to exist and to be trans. But there's almost an illusion that's being put forth that we're sort of a larger percentage of the population than maybe we really are. Yeah, it's just very complicated. I think the best thing for trans representation, I think we're doing it backwards. I think you have to create the material change for trans people to live healthy, fulfilling, full lives, and then representation will blossom from that. You know what I mean? You can't, the more trans people who are able to feed themselves and house themselves and medically transition without a ton of barriers, the more of them who will act and make art and take on, important positions in creative fields. I think, that's really how you do it. And it would make, I could take the criticism because there will always be, at least in my lifetime, there will always be people who don't understand transness and who are frightened by it. But it would make the criticism and the hate a lot easier to swallow if I knew that myself and all my trans friends were having their material needs met in terms of, human rights and medical care and stuff like that. So really, I think the future of trans representation is through providing for trans people to live full lives and not have them struggle all the time. And I think that's why, we put trans people in such difficult conditions and then we, exploit the tragedies of their lives to make powerful art, or I think that's been the trend for the longest time. Non-trans people, who are rightfully fascinated by transness, because transness is fascinating and amazing. And I think that it's something that, almost anyone could gain so much by speaking to trans people and understanding different people's experiences with gender and gender expression. But sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But yeah, I want to see not just trans celebrities cherry picked from, you know, the wealthiest families and the best places in the world. I just want to see trans people living and being happy, and inevitably there will be great trans representation that comes from that. I also think, you know, there's a long history of trans representation in film. I took a feminist film course at NASCAD a few years ago, where one week we had quite the discussion about the history of transness as a tool for horror in films. There's so many excellent, you know, what I would even consider excellent films that do unfortunately rely on exploiting gender, you know, non-conforming people for like dramatic effect, like Psycho or Silence of the Lambs. And I don't think that we need to ban those films or you know, denounce them completely. I don't believe that, because I actually really like those films. I even really like James, you know, the performance of Buffalo Bill. I just think they've had such a negative impact on the cultural perception of trans people, because there aren't, well, one, because you know, they're not really thought out all that well, and they could use some consultation from some trans people to make, you know, I want to see villains in movies who are trans, but I also just want to see a lot of regular protagonists who are trans as well. I think I want to see a full range of trans people, you know, acting in film. I want to see them play good characters. I want to see them play evil characters. I want to see them play funny characters and sad characters. I want it to be a much more full, rich, you know, tapestry. And very importantly, I think if a character is written to be trans, I think it's so important to seek out trans performers, because they will inevitably bring something huge and important to the role that a cis actor just could never approach. And I do think that, you know, the reason that representation in films like Psycho or Silence of the Lambs doesn't hold up is because there was clearly no consultation with any trans people regarding that stuff. But yeah, I want to see just a ton of healthy, happy trans actors, writers, filmmakers, producers, makeup artists, you know, working in film, and there will inevitably be beautiful trans work that stems from there. And briefly, I just want to touch on the notion or the idea of what constitutes a trans film. So just for an example, last year when I was producing my short film, The Score 97.9, with my filmmaking partner, Violet Pask, who's also transgender nonconforming, the script for the story is all about imposter syndrome and the struggle to feel real in your own skin, and the tension of performing all the time. And I think that although, you know, the actor in the film is cisgendered and the character in the film is cisgendered, I think the struggle that character goes through is very related to the trans experience. And I think, having been made by two trans people and other queer people on the film set, I think unquestionably that it's a trans film, even though it's not specifically about a trans character or transition in that way. I think there's a lot of ways you can depict transness, and it can be in more, you know, less specific ways. And I think it's important because it draws similarities between the experiences of non-trans people and trans people. You know, tons of cis people can relate to feeling imposter syndrome, or feeling like you have to put on a performance to be accepted for who you are. And I like that element. I think that there, as much as there are some hard, distinct boundaries between what constitutes, you know, a trans person's experiences and a non-trans person's experience, there's also tons and tons, and there's more that we have in common than we have different, you know. So I think it's good to tell all kinds of trans stories, not just specifically stories about the lives of transgender, transsexual people. although those are important as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Marley. You just said so many really brilliant points. I'm like, wow, thank you. I really like what you said about sometimes it feels like maybe we've done trans representation in film in the opposite direction, or like putting people in front of the camera before they've had their material needs met, and how if we started with the latter, then obviously the representations would come. And also thank you so much for talking about some historical pieces there around how so often trans experiences and specifically trans femininity have all often been the kind of that a joke or some kind of aspect of humor, or even worse, horror in film historically. I think that that is a really important piece of this discussion. So thank you so much. And now I want to pass it over to Shelley. Yeah, so would you like me to reread my question, or
Yeah, sure.
okay. Um I will. It's kind of long, but in terms of forwarding human rights and trans liberation movements, many trans community activists have been critical of the hypervisibility of trans people in the media, and have cautioned that this visibility cannot stand in for real material grassroots change. Can you speak to broadly this topic of the panel, which is trans representation in film, and what that means to you?
Yeah, it is a big thing to keep in your head. I have to say, I think Marley responded brilliantly. I feel like I have almost nothing to add to what she has said, except to say it does distress me when I see a representation where a trans individual is being used as a plot point, a turning point, and we don't know who that person is or why they're there, apart from being, oh, it was really a woman, or oh, it was really a man, and you just go, oh, come on, we're so far past that now. And so those types of representations, I think, are just so problematic. But they would be problematic if we were dealing with any one person standing in for a group of people, and whatever happens suddenly reflects on that whole group of people. And we just can't do that anymore. We've got to comprehend and fully grasp that we're all we're all individuals. And something Marley said early on, and my son says all the time, is while he's prepared to stand up and fight for the rights of trans individuals to live real and authentic lives and be presented with what are human rights opportunities and human rights, proper healthcare, proper all the propers, housing, accommodate, care and right to a decent job, et cetera, nobody wants to be held up, well, maybe some people do, as a poster child representing a whole group of people, because it dehumanizes everybody. And I think for those things to happen in film and television now, we know better, and we know that we can't do that to anybody. So I think Marley spoke really well to that. Oh, there was one thing you said which was so on the money, and I wanted to respond to it. I'm sorry, it's very noisy here. There'll be sirens and singing, and I think the other thing for me is, Marley again speaks to the joy, and I think that, from what I've seen and what I have felt I've been gifted with from the trans individuals I know, is the knowledge that to reach for your authentic self and to attain it, to have a family that love you and say, you go, you do what you have to do, is a joyful experience. You're arriving at a place of full and complete selfness. And I can't I want that experience. I mean, I think that's a wonderful, joyful thing. And I think Dawn felt that, and Dawn's family loved her enough to recognize that they were helping her along the way to that eventually. And so I think stories that recognize the joy of comprehension by the people around you and the joy of realization in yourself, those are really important stories. And I just think we need to see more of them. So I think that was something that Marley said, which I thought was wonderful and affirming, so thank you for that. I think that's it. Oh, Marley.
If I can just add sort of briefly in response to that, I just want to say that, if you're a child or a young person who's coming to terms, internally with the fact that you're trans or that you have to medically transition, it's sort of it sort of rips away your ability to not confront difficulties within yourself and the world. And there's a certain loss of innocence that comes with recognizing that you're trans as a child, and it just forces you to confront a lot of things internally that you might struggle with that are related to your transness but aren't your transness. And in a way, as hard as it is, transitioning is kind of a gift in that sense, that it's kind of a gateway or a pathway to learn so much about yourself that's not just related to your transness, but through that. Anyways, that was all. Thank you.
No, that's a great point. And just in terms of the representation, for example, thinking about the celebrity thing, the oversaturation at the moment, and why that frightens people. I'm sorry, I don't get it. I just think I just don't get it. I mean, I think a lot of the trans individuals who I'm seeing who have become celebrities, maybe partly because of their transness, but often because of their activism, which go hand in hand, but they're not going, hey, look at me, I'm trans. They're going, hey, look at me, I represent the best I can be, and I'm working for that to be accessible to a whole group of people. So I think that's important. I do not understand the fear that it inculcates in people. It's beyond my comprehension. So I don't even hardly know how to respond to it, except to say that, and it's interesting, this is a topic for conversation. I think that if we look within ourselves, we understand, and we're honest, we understand, as my son is always saying, and I've really come to believe, that gender is a construct, and we've been applying this construct of gender inappropriately for centuries because of all kinds of reasons. And my favorite is the patriarchy, but I won't go there. But we've been applying it in a way that makes people afraid to recognize the multiplicity of gender responses they have to their world. Sometimes I respond in a male way, sometimes I respond in a female way, sometimes I respond somewhere in the I don't know, the tadpole way. I don't know. It's like there's such a multiplicity of responses. And I feel that to try and keep breaking down the human experience into just black and white, and that's it, reduces the beauty of the human experience.
Yeah, I think transness frightens a lot of people because it, tears the blanket off of their own illusions about, what categories they fit into, and they're not prepared to confront the fact that maybe there are, multitudes that exist within them. Not to sound a little corny, but I think that's what frightens people. I don't understand that, but
I 100% agree with you. And an interesting response I had at one point to the film was they didn't like this individual found the representation of Marty as somebody who might be struggling with their own gender issues and therefore acting out, which is one take, you know, but on some level, it was a take that I was embracing. They found that offensive because they felt it gave a narrative to the whole queer community that people who are confronting their own queerness and not addressing it become villains. And I went, what? I struggled with that because I think, again, we contain so many contradictions within ourselves, you know, to say, no, it has to be this or that, and we can't represent this or that because, you know, it doesn't make us complex enough artists, thinkers. You know, we have to try to represent a complex human experience, and we may get it wrong sometimes, but, you know, I even say, what's wrong?
I'm really interested to hear that someone had that response about the Marty character. I think that there's room to read that, but there's also room not to read that. And if we're going with the reading that Marty is someone who's maybe struggling with his own gender or sexuality, I don't think that that's, you know, an offensive thing to put forward. I think internalized homophobia and transphobia does a lot of damage to the queer community. I think, you know, it leads to people who can't accept or love themselves lashing out and hurting other people. But I don't think that the film was explicit about that, and I think it left a lot of room. You know, there's so many gray areas. You know, not all gender diverse people are always doing the right thing all the time, and that's a lot of pressure. You know, as a trans woman, especially when I, you know, living publicly, as a trans woman, there's often the feeling of like, well, if I'm rude to a single person on the street, it will speak, you know, for all trans women are just horribly rude. And there's this pressure to always be correct. But, you know, trans and gender nonconforming people and queer people are, you know, they're of all sorts. So that's an interesting reading that someone had of that. I'm not, you know, everyone can have their own feelings about that, but those are my.
And it's good that somebody had that reading to discuss, to make me think more deeply. Is there an issue in the way that's represented? Can I be non-defensive and just go, okay, well, how do I, you know, do I adjust or do I not adjust? Like, no, I don't adjust. You know, and here are the reasons why. But yeah, it's been a fascinating ride, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you both for that really rich discussion. I think that we all have a lot to learn from a lot of what you just shared, especially around that feedback around how folks perceived that specific character in the film, Shelley. I think that's really interesting, and you know, different people's reads on the film would totally transform it for them as well, which is, you know, the power of art. We're not all interpreting it the same. I just want to mention to everyone that I did just send the link I had mentioned earlier, and I want to remind everyone that Dawn, Her Dad and the Tractor is available to screen on demand for free on the Atlantic International Film Festival's online platform until December 10th. So I just sent that in the chat, and I really encourage folks to take advantage of that. And I also want to remind folks who are tuning in and watching that soon we're going to switch over to audience questions. So I really encourage you all to send in any that you have, either right now or as they come up. And I have 2 more questions, maybe just one. We'll see how it goes. But my next question is pretty related to what we were just discussing. So I think it's a good time to throw it in here. And I think it's, and you know, I'm an educator. I teach in schools all over the province. And something I really try to highlight when I'm talking about transphobia with young people is that gender identity and expression were only added to the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act in or code in like 12 years ago, right? In 2012, which is, kind of terrifyingly recent history. So what that means is that prior to that addition in 2012, you could be, you could experience any kind of discrimination, be that in the legal system, in the at the hands of police, even being wrongfully fired from a job without any recourse in terms of legal protections against that discrimination, right? And, it's also been 10 years after what was kind of coined the trans tipping point in 2014, right? And I think those historical pieces are really important because it can feel as if a lot of rights and protections that we benefit from today are permanent and have existed forever, but it's important to also place them in a relatively recent history. So my last question, or maybe second last, depending on how long we chat about this one, is on this topic of like trans representation in film, and with this context of like where we are, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts you want to share, both of you, maybe starting with Marley and then Shelley, on like where you think we kind of need to go in terms of trans folks in the film industry, and how do you think we might get there, I think is a kind of critical aspect of that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, much to think about there. I appreciate you contextualizing some of our rights as trans and gender nonconforming people, because it is something that's, even though there are still so many struggles, for trans people living in Mi'kma'ki, one of the most valuable things that I've had in the last few years since moving to Halifax is even the slightest of relationships with trans and queer elders who, survived the period of time where their rights were not protected. And there's so much to be learned from their experiences, and to listen to the kind of activism that they did and had to do to survive, and for me to have certain privileges, and it contextualizes part of my existence as like a visible trans person, and reminds me of the legacy of activism that I am a part of and that I want to be a part of. And it reminds me, like you said, that these changes for the positive are not necessarily permanent, and they have to continually be spoken about, and they have to continually be pushed, because they can be taken for granted very quickly. And even within, members of my family, struggling to understand all these proposed laws, especially ones in the United States, but there are plenty in Canada, and rules, especially regarding education and the rights of trans people. A lot of people just think, well, how could that ever happen? That's madness. And it's not that mad. It's happened before, and we could be put in difficult places again. So I guess in terms of, the future of trans representation in film and trans safety, I'll kind of, mirror or repeat some of the things that I mentioned before, just in terms of the fact that when trans people are cared for and are able to, live their lives, you inevitably see wonderful work made by trans people and queer people. And I think, so I've only had experience on film sets for the last 3 years of my life now. And there's always a conversation, because all the film sets that I've worked on have had a lot of queer crew and cast members. And I've experienced so much like joy on these sets. And to have queer people who have been in the industry longer than me, talk about, some of the past difficulties of being, say, a lighting technician or a grip or a quote unquote best boy, on set. is really interesting, and it's reminded me how much even within the industry things are changing quite rapidly. And I think it's great because I don't know, this could be just my perception from my little bubble, but I feel like trans and queer people especially are big film nerds and are really, really into film. And I want to see, like, I get a lot of joy from seeing not only, you know, trans performers, but also, you know, I like to see the camera guy is trans, and the you know, the so many of the technical positions can be filled by queer people too. And I think it's important that not just what's in front of the camera is queer and telling an important story, but that the whole production is, you know, a queer space and a queer positive environment, depending on, you know, whether there's 1 or 100 queer people working on set. I think it's possible to make that like a trans friendly environment. And I've seen I've seen hints of that in the productions that I've been on, and it's really wonderful.
Yeah, I will just add my voice to that. I mean, we were really proud on Dawn because we worked really hard to reach out to say, look, we'd really like applications from trans and queer people. And we got, you know, we got them. We didn't get enough, but that's changed. Even just in the 2 or 3 years since Dawn, I've seen it. I've seen a dramatic change. And my experience, to be frank, is the more queer people on a film set, the happier it is. The more gentle. I mean, you know, I don't know, call me, I might be a little prejudiced, but I just find there's a respect for each other that is which is changed from my early days in film, where it was not so respectful and there was a predominance of one gender over another. And I'm glad to see that that is shifting, you know, a lot. You know, it raises interesting questions about, you know, the importance of passing for trans individuals, and at what point, you know, is passing, do you give up the value of passing from a personal point of view, as opposed to recognizing the value of stating out front that you're a trans individual so that it can be seen? So in terms of those film sets, you know, the self-declarations of I am a queer individual, I'm a non-binary individual, I'm a trans individual. You know, I think there's a lot of individuals who still don't necessarily know whether they want to self-declare so that they can be included in when people are trying to create inclusive sets. I feel those declarations are important, but they're not my declarations to make. So it's a complicated thing. I am a woman over 60. I think, you know, this is not the same thing at all, and I'm not putting it in the same boat. But what I am saying is that it seems to me if we're going to have the whole experience of the whole humanity, we need to know where people sit and what their challenges are, so that we can find ways of helping to represent them across the board, especially in film, which is supposed to be representing all human experience. And I think exactly as you said, Marley, that because we're not going to see that on every screen, it would be really great if we had it behind the scenes and off camera, so because I know as a filmmaker, I was listening to my gaffer, I was listening to my Jenny operator, who was the wonderful Katie Brooker. I have to say, she was amazing. You know, I hear people say, you know, that more brains make better work, more collaboration, as long as it's not, you know, as long as we understand where the source of a story sits, but collaboration on how can I best achieve this? How can I be more honest than I'm being? What's the bet? Like what, you know, those things help us. And I think if those things help make a better film, and there are more trans and queer people behind the scenes, we're going to have a more complete experience represented on screen everywhere for every project.
Thank you both so much for your responses to that question. I think it's really hand in hand with thinking about like the material needs of trans people and like employment in the film industry beyond just roles of acting. And something that I think is really incredible is seeing more like mentorship programs pop up that are specifically for trans and non-binary people. I know there's the trans film mentorship program, which has trans and non-binary folks staffed on different, I think it might be specifically CBC productions, but it might be a couple different ones. And I'm really hoping that we see um, more of that stuff in the future. So it's 1:20. So I think that we should turn it over to the audience questions now, if that sounds good. And they're pretty specific around pre-production and production. I'm just going to read the first one to you, and just reminding folks to please send in any more questions that you have. So the first question is someone wondering if Shelley can talk more about the experience through the pre-production decision-making process, like decisions regarding character, specific choices, and setting.
Yeah, so I'll address the setting first. Because this story was accessing a lot of my own experiences, and because, you know, I am a come from away to Nova Scotia, I fell in love with the province and the multiplicity of its, you know, the incredible topography in the province. And I wanted people to see how beautiful it is here. And so that was the significance of the setting. But I think also the beauty of a setting can make situations more poignant when they're ugly. And so there were things in the film that were not beautiful, and behaviors that were not appropriate or kind or what one would hope for, but were in beautiful circumstances. I'm thinking of a scene on the beach, beautiful spot, and horrible behavior. And so those things, the settings were important to me from that point of view. And also, you know, I had a specific experience of Antigonish. I lived there for many years. I saw that town change dramatically from a town where, when my kid was in high school, there wasn't a GSA in the high school, and he worked really hard to make sure that a GSA came to exist there, and with others, not just by himself, with some wonderful teachers. And, you know, so and that town, you know, it's not a perfect rural town, but it's a town that has seen big changes. And I think that's important. It's been an example in many ways. So the setting, the specific choices about setting were drawn by my own personal feelings about that place and about what I wanted to represent in terms of the way it looked. Character specific choices, I guess you'd have to ask me exactly what in particular, because I've been talking about this a lot because I've been traveling around the province with my first novel, which is visiting these characters in a very much deeper way than a feature film can allow in an hour and a half. And the character specific choices are profoundly impacted by who those characters are, you know, and as I discover them, like, so I'm not sure if your question is specifically about the trans individual or about the other characters. I mean, as a writer, you know, I have to fall in love with all my characters, even the characters who are negatively impacting the story in some way, like the Marty character. I still have to love that person and want them to be the truest version of themselves, even if it's not a particularly attractive version of themselves. It's a a kind of version of actors not judging their characters when they're playing their characters. I have no way of knowing whether that's made sense to you, anonymous attendee. Um,
That's wonderful though. Thank you for all the info on that pre-production pieces, and especially the stuff around setting and how that influences the vibe of different scenes that might have had different emotions in different places. And you did mention your novel, which I would love to share any kind of link. If you wanted to send me one in the chat, I could share it with the audience. I've been made co-host, so I can send things to folks. And there's one more question here, which I feel like it can be our last question because it is 1:25. Just whenever you're ready, Shelley, it is a question more specifically for you as well.
okay.
And I will read it when you're ready.
Hang on, I'm just trying to figure out how to share this in the
Yeah.
chat. I'll just do that. Resistance or negative responses. Well, I tended not to hear from people who had negative responses. We did have some sad situations where there was some, I'm sure you've heard of review bombing and stuff like that, where what happened was on a website that Dawn was represented, some review bombers who I presumed maybe they were anti-me, but I suspect they were anti-trans people who'd gone in and a review bombed so that it was the lowest to pull the rating down of the film, which, you know, there's nothing we can do about that. Review bombers do that to all kinds of stuff. They do it for personal reasons. They do it for political reasons. You know, it's a sad truth that people are so frightened of stories that they have to do that. But the good news is what I did hear was a lot of positive stuff, to be frank. I got emails and letters all the time. I continue to get them from families. So that's families and trans individuals who said, much as Marley has, that, you know, sometimes it was a bit shocking to see their experience represented, you know, but in a good way. So that was great. Locations, communities, no negative experiences. All we had was positivity and joy in collaborating and cooperating and feeling like people were moving something forward. I think they felt like they were actually helping shift the narrative. And I think they were proud of that. So we didn't have a single thing. But again, you know, I was surrounded by people who were working hard not to see the negative side of stuff. So that was a gift. Streaming services, you know, who knows on that? You know, the film isn't on as many streaming services as I would like. I don't have control over that. I don't believe it's anti-trans. I don't know what that's about. But I know that the more people who ask to see something, the more likely it is that eventually it gets out into a bigger world. The film is available at the moment on Amazon Prime, and I understand that eventually it's going to be on some of the platforms that will be servicing the States and the UK, where I'm getting a lot of requests. So I hope that happens, because I do think the film has a really good place to occupy in terms of starting conversations. And I'm really proud of that.
As you should be. All right. Thank you for those questions from the audience, everyone. I just want to recognize it's 1:29 p.m. I think it's actually rather miraculous that we're almost perfect with our timing here. And just to wrap up, I just really want to thank Marley and Shelley so much for joining us as panelists today. I also really want to thank Jeff and the team at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. And of course, I also really want to thank the Atlantic International Film Festival for providing the platform for this free on-demand screening of Dawn, Her Dad, and the Tractor. And I also really want to shout out to our ASL interpreters, May and Monica, thank you so much, as well as our captioner, Lori. So with that, this concludes our panel. I don't know if you two have any final words you'd like to share.
I would just say it was such a pleasure to be able to talk with you all and share these experiences. Shelley, it was so fantastic to connect with you, and I'm really grateful for the experience. Also, Brody, thank you so much. You did such a fantastic job as moderator.
Yeah, I want to echo everything Marley said. I feel like I just want to go through this panel echoing everything Marley said, but I do. And I hope to keep in touch with you guys for sure. But also I want to give a shout out to the producer of this film, Terry Greenlaw at Picture Plant, and she was the one who ultimately, with the present distributor, was able to give the okay for this to happen, and to Martha Cooley for reaching out as well. These things, they mean a lot to us as filmmakers, because we obviously don't want our films just to end up on shelves. We want them to impact people and keep impacting people. And so, yeah, I'm really grateful to you all for having used the film for this discussion, and for having me get to meet Marley and to see you in person, Brody.
Yes, it's been really wonderful. Thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. And a reminder, this will be available on the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission's website as well. All right, that's everything, everyone. Thank you so much.